My name is Caitlin Chase, and today I'll be presenting on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD. For today's presentation, I'll be going over DSM-5 criteria, importance, factors in etiology and maintenance, and then lastly, empirically supported treatments for ADHD. So to get started, what is ADHD? So ADHD is a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development as characterized by inattention and or hyperactivity and impulsivity. Fun fact, to your right, you can see that Midwestern states have the highest rates of ADHD in the country, which I thought was very interesting. In the DSM, in order for an individual to meet the inattention subtype, if they are younger than 17, they must endorse 6 or more of the following symptoms. If they are 17 and older, they must endorse at least 5 of the following symptoms. Across all age groups, the symptoms must have persisted for at least 6 months and must have impacted the individual directly in terms of social, academic, or occupational activities. So some of the inattention subtypes include failing to give close attention to details or make careless mistakes in schoolwork. The individual may have difficulty sustaining attention. They may not seem to listen to and spoken directly. They may not follow through on instruction or fail to finish schoolwork. Often has difficulty organizing tasks and activities. They may avoid, dislike, or be reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort. So they may procrastinate on those bigger projects when it comes to work or schoolwork. They may lose things necessary for tasks, so books, pencils, their eyeglasses, etc. They may be easily distracted by external stimuli. They may be forgetful in daily activities. They may not remember those upcoming assignments or big projects that are happening at work. For an individual to meet the hyperactivity impulsivity subtype, it's the same. So over the age 17 and older, they must meet 5 or more. Younger than 17, they must meet 6 or more that have persisted for 6 months. Some of these symptoms include fidgeting. They may leave their seat in situations when they shouldn't leave their seat. So class lecture, church, board meeting. They may run about or climb in situations when is inappropriate. It's most common in children. So in adolescents or adults, they may just feel very restless. They may feel on the go, acting as if driven by a motor. They may talk excessively, blurt out answers before a question has been completed. They may have difficulty waiting their turn and interrupt or intrude on others, so butting into conversations. The other criterion for ADHD diagnosis is that several of these inattentive or hyperactive impulsive symptoms must have been present prior to age 12. Several of these symptoms must be present in 2 or more settings, so they can't just occur at school. They have to occur at school and another location, so work or home or with friends, etc. There is clear evidence that the symptoms interfere with or reduce the quality of social, academic, or occupational functioning. And the symptoms do not occur exclusively due to the cause of another mental disorder, and they also do not occur as a result of substance intoxication or withdrawal. With ADHD, the clinician or therapist can specify the specific type of presentation, whether it's combined or inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive. They can also specify if it's in partial remission and also the current severity, just based off of the number of symptoms that were met. For differential diagnoses in children, it's important to consider oppositional defiant disorder and intermittent explosive disorder. It's important to establish if the aversion to school is from the mentally demanding tasks, forgetting instructions, or what that oppositional attitude is derived from. With intermittent explosive disorder, both ADHD and IED share high levels of that impulsive behavior, so it's really important to differentiate between and why that behavior is being exhibited. In adults, ADHD can often be confused with anxiety disorders and or depressive disorders. With anxiety, the individual may feel restless and have a hard time focusing. They may focus more on external stimuli. But between ADHD and anxiety, in ADHD, there's no worry or rumination, which is commonly seen with anxiety disorders. With depressive disorders, individuals may have a hard time concentrating. So it's just really important to establish and gain more information. That way you can make an accurate diagnosis. In clinical settings, comorbid disorders are frequent in individuals whose symptoms meet criteria for ADHD, such as oppositional defiant disorder, which we talked about in the previous slide, other conduct disorders, which occur in about a quarter of children or adolescents with the combined presentation of ADHD, a specific learning disorder, anxiety disorders and major depressive disorders, intermittent explosive disorders, antisocial and other personality disorders, and in a minority of adults with ADHD, substance abuse disorders may also be co-occurring. Here is a chart from the CDC regarding percentage of children with ADHD with another disorder. So as you can see, 52% of children with ADHD have another behavior or conduct problem, followed closely by anxiety with 33%. Importance and other facts. Population surveys suggest that ADHD occurs in most cultures in about 5% of children and about 2.5% of adults. It's more frequent in males than in females. There's a 2-to-1 ratio in children and a 1.6-to-1 in adults. Females are more likely than males to present primarily with the inattentive features. So as you can see from this chart by the ADHD Institute in 2020, the most common time for symptoms to become present is age 6 to 12, followed closely by 3 to 5 years. Impairment. ADHD can cause elevated interpersonal conflict, likelihood for substance use disorders and incarceration in the future, especially if the individual does not seek treatment. ADHD can also cause family relationships and peer relationships to be challenged and subject to more conflict. As far as academic deficits, ADHD definitely increases that risk just because of the inability to concentrate and focus. And that could also lead to peer neglect and peer rejection. Overall, ADHD contributes to poor time management, procrastination, distractibility, ultimately affecting the individual socially, academically, and or occupationally. Here's a nice visual by Harpin in 2015 that kind of goes into the different impairment levels that occur with age groups. As you can see, the older the individual gets, the more impairments that are present. Impact on others. So we kind of talked about this previously, but ADHD can put a strain on personal relationships and has also been associated with increased healthcare costs. So in this visual, you can see ADHD versus the national norm for boys is significantly lower across all categories in terms of self-esteem, behavior, family activities. And this was also from Harpin 2015. So without treatment, an individual may be subjected to an impaired quality of life, impaired relationships, reduced employment, vulnerability to addiction, vulnerability to depression and anxiety, impaired driving safety, premature death from accidents, and suicide, unfortunately. Those last three can definitely be attributed to that impulsive aspect of ADHD. So the etiology of ADHD is considered a multifactorial process whereby the genetic predisposition and biological vulnerabilities are assumed to be most important. Genetically, ADHD is elevated in the first degree, biological relatives of individuals with ADHD, which means that the heritability of ADHD is substantial. And while specific genes have been correlated with ADHD, they are neither necessary for sufficient causal factors. Environmentally, very low birth weight conveys a 2 to 3-fold risk for ADHD, although most children with low birth weight don't develop ADHD. ADHD is sometimes correlated with smoking during pregnancy, but that can also be associated with a common genetic risk. ADHD can be associated with reactions to aspects of diet, a history of child abuse, neglect, multiple foster homes, neurotoxin exposure, infections, or alcohol exposure in utero. Temperamentally, ADHD is associated with reduced behavioral inhibition, effortful control, or constraint, negative emotionality, and or elevated novelty seeking. These traits may predispose some children to ADHD, but are not specific to the disorder. ADHD doesn't go away on its own because it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, which means that genetics and heritability do play a very large role in this disorder. And while symptoms may seem to disappear or go away as an individual gets older, that doesn't mean that ADHD has disappeared. It might simply mean that the adult has developed coping skills that address their symptoms well enough to prevent ADHD from interfering with their daily lives. The strongest empirical support for ADHD and treatment is in regard to cognitive behavioral therapy interventions. Findings have also indicated support for the effectiveness of mindfulness, dialectic behavior therapy, DBT, and neurofeedback. Other types of interventions also demonstrated effectiveness. However, the support was limited due to the general lack of available research. Empirically supported treatments. So before we get into this, I think it's important to touch on what empirically supported treatments are. So they refer to specific psychological treatments for a specific population or disorder, so in this case ADHD, that has been proven effective in controlled research. ADHD is based on a multimodal approach that combines medication with specific psychological interventions. A lot of the times it's pairing either a stimulant or non-stimulant medication, Adderall, Ritalin, Vyvanse, with a particular type of therapy. Most commonly it's CBT, where they work to build skills and routine focused on organization, prioritization, and time management. And then lastly, children with ADHD, it's important and sometimes helpful for their parent to be trained in specific skills training, which could improve that positive parent-child relationship, encourage appropriate child behavior with incentive systems, and implement appropriate and consistent consequences for child misbehavior. In one study that I read, it was a randomized control trial of CBT therapy for adults with ADHD with and without medication. This was a double-blind experiment over the course of 9 CBT sessions. 23 participants underwent CBT and also took medication prescribed for ADHD. And then the other group of participants, there's 25 of them, underwent CBT but took a placebo medication. Participant ages ranged from 18 to 66. Overall, after the course of 9 CBT sessions, after measuring functionality and improvement of symptoms using the ADHD-RS inventory and the Sheehan Disability Scale, results showed that both groups improved in terms of symptoms and functioning. And ultimately, we found that the use of medication did not significantly improve the outcome over and above the use of just CBT with the placebo drug. Looking forward, it is really important for more studies to address the efficacy and tolerability of ADHD core symptoms, not only in the short term, but also in the long term. We still need further empirical support for the non-pharmacological and multimodal treatments. And here are the references for my presentation. If you have any questions, please comment or send me a message. Thank you very much.